The year was 1861, a pivotal moment in American history that would forever alter the nation's trajectory. The United States, a nation founded on principles of liberty and equality, found itself teetering on the brink of a devastating internal conflict. The ideals that had once united the country were now the very issues driving it apart. The issue of slavery, a festering wound on the soul of the nation since its inception, had finally reached a boiling point. The moral and economic implications of this institution had created an insurmountable divide between the North and the South. The Southern states, with their economies deeply reliant on enslaved labor, viewed any attempts to restrict or abolish slavery as an existential threat to their way of life. Their entire social and economic structure was built upon this foundation, making any change seem like an attack on their very existence. In the North, abolitionist sentiment was growing, fueled by moral outrage and a belief in the fundamental rights of all people, regardless of race. The voices calling for the end of slavery were becoming louder and more influential, creating a sense of urgency and moral imperative. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of the nation. The tension was palpable, and the country was on the edge of a precipice, with both sides preparing for what seemed like an inevitable clash. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, a man who had campaigned on a platform of preventing the expansion of slavery, proved to be the tipping point. His victory was seen as a direct threat to the Southern way of life, and it catalyzed the secession movement. Deeply distrustful of Lincoln and his intentions, 11 Southern states seceded from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. This bold move was a declaration of their intent to preserve their way of life at any cost. This act of secession was a direct challenge to the authority of the federal government and raised a fundamental question. Could a nation born from the flames of revolution survive such a profound internal division? The very fabric of the Union was being tested. The secession of the Southern states did not immediately lead to war. There was a brief period of tense standoff with both sides hoping for a peaceful resolution. Diplomatic efforts were made, but the underlying issues were too deep and complex to be easily resolved. There was a brief period of tense standoff with both sides hoping for a peaceful resolution. Leaders on both sides engaged in heated discussions, trying to find a way to avoid the impending conflict. However, the mistrust and animosity were too great. However, the situation was akin to a powder keg awaiting a spark, and that spark would come in the form of a small, strategically important island fort in Charleston Harbor, Fort Sumter. The events that would unfold there would ignite the flames of war, setting the stage for a conflict that would shape the future of the United States. Fort Sumter, a masonry fortification situated on a man-made island at the entrance to Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, stands as a testament to the turbulent times of the American Civil War. This imposing structure, with its thick walls and strategic location, was designed to protect one of the South's most vital ports. It became an unlikely focal point in the unfolding drama of the American Civil War, drawing the attention of both the Union and the Confederacy. The fort's significance was not just in its physical presence but in what it represented to both sides. Completed in 1860, the fort was intended to bolster the defenses of one of the most important ports in the South. Its construction was a monumental task, involving the transportation of thousands of tons of granite and other materials to create the artificial island on which it stands. However, its strategic significance took on a whole new dimension in the wake of South Carolina's secession from the Union in December 1860. The fort, once a symbol of protection, now stood at the heart of a brewing conflict. With the secession of South Carolina, Fort Sumter, still under Union control, became an irritating symbol of federal authority within the newly declared Confederacy. The presence of Union troops in the fort was a constant reminder to the Confederates of the federal government's refusal to relinquish control. Conversely, for the Union, the fort represented a vital foothold in the South, a symbol of the federal government's refusal to acknowledge the legitimacy of secession. It was a beacon of hope for those who believed in the preservation of the Union. The fate of Fort Sumter, it seemed, would serve as a bellwether for the larger conflict brewing between the North and the South. The tension surrounding the fort was palpable, with both sides understanding that its control could tip the scales of war. In the months leading up to the outbreak of hostilities, both sides engaged in a delicate dance of diplomacy and military posturing. Meetings were held, strategies were devised, and both the Union and the Confederacy prepared for the inevitable clash. The Confederate government demanded the surrender of the fort, arguing that it rightfully belonged to the newly formed Confederacy. They saw the fort as a key piece of their new nation's territory and were determined to claim it. President Lincoln, however, refused to cede federal property, believing that doing so would be tantamount to recognizing the legitimacy of secession. He stood firm in his resolve, understanding that the surrender of Fort Sumter would set a dangerous precedent. As tensions mounted, both sides reinforced their positions, transforming Fort Sumter into a tinderbox, awaiting a single spark to ignite the flames of war. The soldiers stationed there knew that they were on the brink of a significant and potentially devastating conflict, one that would shape the future of the nation. The drama that unfolded at Fort Sumter centered around two men: Major Robert Anderson, the commander of the Union garrison at Fort Sumter, a man of principle and dedication to his duty, and Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard, the Confederate officer tasked with securing the fort for the Confederacy, a man equally committed to his cause. Both men were graduates of the prestigious United States Military Academy at West Point and had fought side by side in the Mexican-American War, where they forged a bond of camaraderie and mutual respect. Now, however, they found themselves on opposing sides of a conflict that threatened to tear their nation apart, a nation already frayed by the contentious issue of slavery and states' rights. Anderson, a career soldier known for his unwavering loyalty and sense of duty, was a native of Kentucky, a state deeply divided on the issue of slavery. His commitment to the Union was a testament to his belief in the preservation of the nation. Despite his Southern roots, Anderson remained steadfast in his commitment to the Union, believing that the unity of the states was paramount to the survival of the country. Beauregard, on the other hand, was a Louisiana native and a staunch advocate for the Southern cause. His decision to join the Confederacy was driven by his belief in the rights of states to govern themselves and maintain their way of life. A skilled engineer and strategist, Beauregard had resigned his commission in the United States Army to join the Confederacy, a move that underscored his dedication to the Southern cause and his willingness to fight for what he believed was right. The personal and professional relationship between Anderson and Beauregard added a layer of complexity to the already tense situation at Fort Sumter. Their history together made the impending conflict even more poignant and tragic. They had been friends and colleagues, their lives intertwined through their shared experiences in the military. Their bond was one forged in the crucible of war, making their current opposition all the more heart-wrenching. Now duty and loyalty demanded that they face each other as enemies. The principles they each held dear had placed them on a collision course, with the fate of the nation hanging in the balance. The attack on Fort Sumter would be a pivotal moment in their lives, marking the end of their friendship and the beginning of a bloody conflict that would test the very fabric of their nation. It was a moment that symbolized the deep divisions within the country, divisions that would lead to years of brutal warfare and immense suffering. Section 4. The siege begins. 34 hours that shook a nation. In the pre-dawn hours of April 12, 1861, the tense standoff at Fort Sumter erupted into open conflict. At 4:30 a.m., Confederate batteries surrounding Charleston Harbor unleashed a furious bombardment on the beleaguered fort. The first shots fired at Fort Sumter signaled the beginning of the American Civil War, a conflict that would claim the lives of over 600,000 Americans and leave an enduring scar on the nation's psyche. The Confederate bombardment, a thunderous barrage of artillery fire, continued relentlessly for 34 hours. Fort Sumter, manned by a relatively small force of Union soldiers, endured the onslaught with remarkable resilience. Confined within the fort's thick walls, Major Anderson and his men returned fire as best they could, but they were heavily outgunned and outmatched. The fort's masonry crumbled under the relentless bombardment, and fires raged within its confines. As the bombardment continued, it became increasingly clear that the Union garrison at Fort Sumter could not withstand the Confederate assault indefinitely. Supplies were dwindling, ammunition was running low, and the fort itself was on the verge of collapse. With the situation growing more dire by the hour, Major Anderson made the difficult decision to surrender the fort to prevent further bloodshed. Section 5. A bloodless opening act, the surrender of Fort Sumter. On the afternoon of April 13, 1861, after enduring over a day of relentless bombardment, Major Robert Anderson, realizing the futility of further resistance, raised the white flag of surrender over Fort Sumter. The Confederate forces led by General P.G.T. Beauregard had achieved their objective. Fort Sumter, a symbol of federal authority within the Confederacy, was now in their hands. Remarkably, despite the intensity of the bombardment, the fighting at Fort Sumter resulted in no casualties on either side. The only fatality occurred during the surrender ceremony, when a Union soldier was killed by the accidental explosion of a cannon salute. The bloodless nature of the engagement, however, would prove to be an anomaly in the bloody conflict that followed. The surrender of Fort Sumter sent shockwaves through the nation. It was a stark and sobering realization that the sectional tensions that had been simmering for decades had finally boiled over into open warfare. The nation, once united by a shared history and a common purpose, was now irrevocably divided.